I think we are now live. Welcome to Macquarie University. Welcome to Macquarie Business School. My name is Snell. I'm the Academic Program Director. Today I have Peter Russell from Russell Reynolds. Peter Obrien, beg your pardon, from Russell Reynolds. Thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Thanks, Lynn.
So today what we're going to do, I know there's about over 200 people that have registered for this webinar. This has been broadcast live from Sydney, Australia. We are also going to record this session for those unable to make the recording, so don't worry, you can get access to it. What we're going to be talking today is with Russell Reynolds, really focusing on one of their most recent thought leadership pieces called Global and Regional Leadership. But before we go into that, I'd like, Peter, if you could actually share some thoughts and an overview of Russell Reynolds and what you do for the audience.
Pleasure. And firstly, thank you, Len. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to join you all today. So let me try and give you a little bit of a snapshot in terms of who Russell Reynolds is and what it is we effectively do. So we're a global organisation that in essence advise boards and CEOs of organisations, public, private, government, not-for-profits, NGOs, on leadership issues. And so that can range from anything from advising how a board is performing, the directors of that board, the appointment of performance of a CEO of an organisation, and typically the reports, what we call the C-suite of an organisation that ultimately lead that organisation. And offices in terms of our presence around the world means that we operate in mature Western markets from the US, UK, Western Europe, Australia, through to emerging markets from China, South America, across all of Asia and Eastern Europe. So quite a global mindset.
And that's a fantastic position to be able to offer some commentary on some of the leadership characteristics that are coming across at a global level and also from a regional perspective. So now what we're going to do is tap into some of that experience that you can share with us. We're going to be talking specifically about a white paper, and that's called Global and Regional Leadership Trends 2019. I think it was published in March this year.
Correct.
And it does do a fantastic job of, I think, summarising or capturing leadership trends from a global perspective, an America's perspective, an Asia-Pac perspective, and what was it, the European, Middle East and Africa. So let's start off with some sort of the global sort of characteristics that you're looking at, shaping some of the leadership trends no matter what area you're in. I think you mentioned a number of things. I think there are three things that I'd like to tap on specifically. One was multinationals meets nationalism. Now that's clearly in play across the world right now. I mean, we see the events happening political events happening in Hong Kong, a number of other political events and across the world. We can't, as organisations and as leaders, be acting in a value-free space in amongst all these sort of activities, can we?
No, and let me try and decouple a couple of the points you raised, Lane. One is we live in a world today that is arguably more volatile, more subject to change than it's ever been. If you look at the whole issue around the nationalistic approach that's evolved from the US talks of building walls with Mexico through to Brexit and the demise of the relationship with the European community and through to, as you've just mentioned, Hong Kong, etc. So the world is going through quite a fragile point of trying to evolve in a way that's either protecting its nationalistic interests, but at the same time collaborating with partners who share the same values. And that makes it quite interesting because globally you're seeing a shift of power. And one of the interesting observations when you look at the next 10, really only the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to go through in the next generation some of the most dramatic change that we've seen in decades, if not a century. Where in the next 10 years, we will move to find that the 5 biggest economies in the world, 4 of them will be in Asia. China will surpass the US. In the top 10 economies of the world, there is likely to be only 2 Western economies left, the US and Germany. Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia are countries that are expanding so quickly. So that has an immediate impact on the world. And what was traditionally a Western evolved world over the last 100, 200 years is moving quickly to be arguably what's called this century of being the Asian century. And that has dramatic impacts. Now, touching on the second issue around what does that mean in terms of values? Because what it does draw out is this aspect of what are the factors that make up the fabric of an economy, of a country, of a people, their belief systems, which can be everything from faith to what's important to them economically, who do they have relationships with, which going across the broadness of the world we live in, which is why we break it down to a regional level, is extraordinarily complex. So I think it goes back to the point I made at the outset. It is arguably the most complex and volatile environment for a long, long time that we're operating in, which has an impact on leadership.
Indeed. And so, often there's an acronym that has been turned around, that whole, I really hate the term, is it the Bucco World, the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world that we operate in. And indeed, these are the times that we do. And it is politically charged. It is one that is characterised by a very active sort of presence. That has to have an impact on how organisations make a stance on things. Now, increasingly we see inside the rise of consumerism, people now, what you've just talked about, are more connected with passion, with purpose-led organisations. Basically, that means that organisations need to make a stand. When we say organisations, leaders need to make a stance on what they believe in, what that organisation is aligned with. And so that speaks to the whole underlying purpose of values. How do you appoint a leader that is the right leader to reflect those value sets? What is the process in actually identifying that person?
Sure. So it's probably no surprise. The first point is to really define very clearly what are the values and what is the purpose of the organisation. So before you can start to think of what is the leadership that needs to fulfil that objective, it's defining what is the purpose. And it's quite interesting for us, Len, because we as an organisation, when I talk about what we do is in advising boards and CEOs around leadership, we had to ourselves define what is the purpose of our organisation so that when we're advising others, we can ourselves reflect it. And really we brought it down to a simple thing for ourselves. It's to really improve the way the world is led. Very simplistic. So everything that we do should reflect that. The people that lead our organisation, the people we hire and recruit to be part of our organisation need to fulfil everything that falls under that in terms of values and capability. So to answer your question, it's really around defining what is the purpose of an organisation, what are the values, and then it comes down to how do you appoint, whether it be the board of directors, the CEO and the leadership team, to fulfil that requirement. And then when you go through the usual process in doing that, you need to test through different means. But one of the most logical ways is to look at the way a person has behaved by experience. So someone's track record, not only in terms of their previous role, but what they do personally, how they behave in everyday life. We live in a world with technology and transparency that it's not very difficult in this day and age to find out the background of some person and their behaviours and style. That becomes a critical aspect around the appointment of any leader, frankly, in any market around the world. And then the nuances that need to be taken into account, depending again on the market that you're talking about.
So it's not sort of like an overnight, sort of a quick sort of approach to recruitment. It really is trying to understand the behavioural and the psychographic profile of that candidate. I can see that there's a question coming through right now, and we do encourage questions to be to centre your questions, and we'll try and address as many as possible as we go through. But I can see a question from Stacey that actually builds on that point that you just made there, Peter, in relation to diagnostic innovations. And I guess technology plays a large part in us being a bit more agile when we're coming to assess leadership characteristics. Now, there's the usual psychometric kind of tests that a candidate at that level in terms of leadership should be exposed to and assessed for. But are there any new interventions, any new sort of diagnostic approaches when we're looking at cultural fit, when we're looking at emotional intelligence, when we're looking at those other softer skills that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, today there's a mixture of tools that are used, psychometrics. I mean, we work with an organisation that many of you would be familiar with, Hogan, where we've exclusively developed an approach to assess leadership capabilities and fit, cultural fit as well as other aspects. And there are other factors that you can't take away, which is effectively the meeting and assessment, judgment. So individuals who can actually assess candidates and their fit for a role and to me, as much as we are developing AI, data analytics, and some extraordinary capabilities that will impact and improve the predictability of a leader being successful, there is also that really important judgment factor that will not go away. But today, in picking up on one of the words you used, agility, again, given the nature of the world we live in today, leaders today run organisations that encompass multiple countries, often mature markets through to immature markets, different environments in terms of legal systems, even different value systems. So their ability to be agile, their ability to be able to what we call flex, and flex at different times. And one of the interesting ones, just to focus on a specific area, one of the things we test for today more often than not for a CEO is someone who can be pragmatic but strategic, sometimes conflicting. But the reality is their ability to be able to dial it up when it's necessary to be pragmatic and dial it down when it is important that is dialed down, but actually look at being strategic when it needs to be that factor that comes to play. So this ability to be agile and flex amongst a number of capabilities is very important, and not just at different times, in different markets. And I look at some Western companies, given what mentioned earlier about the changing dynamics of world economies, an American company that's headquartered in the US today, in a market that's dealing with what continues to be a growth engine in the US under Trump's leadership, is a different dynamic to deal with a market in Southeast Asia, or even China for that matter, and how you actually flex your interaction and communication skills in those environments is very important.
That's a really interesting notion, that notion of being flexible, agile. The literature, I research a bit in sort of the service literature, marketing literature. There's a term that they use called ambidexterity in terms of how organisations respond, and how is it possible that an organisation can be both sales-led and also marketing at the same time. It's almost like our antithesis. So what you're suggesting is that today's leader, in order to deal with the complexities that is presented to them, needs to demonstrate an ambidextrous approach to leadership. Be strategic at the same time as being tactical.
Yep.
Hard characteristics, right?
It's really tough. And the reality is you do not get a person who fits every single aspect.
So it's going to be my next question. Does such a person exist?
They typically don't, but it's clearly from a predictability perspective. If a board of a company is appointing a CEO, they want to understand the strengths and the gaps of an individual. And by understanding those and predicting what the environment they're going to work in is then important to be able to help them develop as a CEO. I mean, as an example, one of the most important things that we do today that effectively didn't exist only 5 years ago is it's one thing to help board to appoint a CEO. It's to continue working with that CEO for the first 2 to 3 to 4 years to make sure they're developing and being successful. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is to surround that person with people who have different skills and capabilities. And we can talk about the whole focus on diversity, but diversity hits that really hard and square in terms of not only about gender, ethnicity, but it's also around capabilities. And we talk about diversity of thinking. That creates a holistic capability from a leadership perspective.
I was just about to say, I mean, because the reality is that not one person embodies all those capabilities. And so you're quite right in that person brings a certain skill set to the table, a leadership characteristic, but then has a team that speaks to those different areas. I can see a whole bunch of questions that have been submitted. It's just a little hard for me. So, Sophia, I'm wondering if you can increase that sort of font size so I can actually read it. Otherwise, it's a real eye test for me.
I can't read that.
I still can't read it. I'm really sorry about that. Perhaps you can read it out to me, Sophia.
In this context, would you call President of the US, Donald Trump, a pragmatic or a strategic leader? If yes or no, why?
Okay, so I think the question was, is Trump a pragmatic leader or a strategic leader? Yes, no, why? Thank you very much. Who submitted that question? Sushi. Thank you. What do you think, Peter? I don't know. It's a really sort of like a yes-no sort of question.
It's quite an interesting one. So when we train, it's interesting he's used as an example.
Right.
So when we train people to be able to judge and assess people around these dynamics, it's quite interesting because more people put him into the pragmatic box than the strategic. The only challenge that's raised is, depending on the situation, he is seen as quite strategic, particularly around his ability to negotiate. So putting aside the view of Trump himself, the fact is there would seem to be evidence that would show that he has the ability to flex and be pragmatic when necessary and be strategic. And then underpinning that is then value sets that go with that, which is another issue altogether.
But just tapping on that value set, irrespective of your view of Trump, he has a certain skill to connect, to resonate with his message to America at the moment. So, that's another skill set that we sort of are dancing around, is that the ability to resonate, that ability to connect, and really on an authentic level, share that shared values, share that shared vision that you have, and that surely is a characteristic of a good leader.
Yeah, and it is. It's quite interesting because another aspect we will look at is the ability to galvanise.
Yeah. So
you could actually argue he has been very effective at galvanising the US, but at the same time, there's another aspect, being humble. So there is this issue to what works best in whatever circumstances to achieve the goal, and therefore underpinning that, what is the purpose?
And so in light of that discussion, we talked a lot about the organisations these days and leaders operating in a very complex world, and that out of that complexity, that really the shape of leadership going forward is to make a very proactive stance on where you feel right. That could also be very divisive as well, the galvanising aspect there, because it's actually a risk to be out there saying, our organisation XYZ believes very firmly in this principle here. Then that kind of isolates a whole bunch of other people there. What do you think about that play?
I think the interesting thing that a lot of it all comes back to is authenticity.
Right.
And I think the moment, particularly in this day and age, and I find this has been part of what we have found with generations coming through, is the ability to see through messages that are not really authentic and are serving an agenda beyond what's the real purpose. And so what I've certainly found from my own experience when dealing with leadership is the most effective leaders, when they galvanise, are ones who truly speak from the heart. And it's all been backed up by their own personal practices and their own behaviours, as opposed to those who will say one thing but do something very different. And and this will apply to a leader of a global organisation or someone who will run a business unit. The walk the talk and how they behave has a direct impact on their own values and the perception of their own credibility and integrity. And that factor continues today, and so it should, in my view, to be a critical part in assessing any leader.
Yeah, indeed. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that, and I'll have to ask you, Sophia, again to pick out a question for me, as I can't see that from this distance here.
Okay, one of the questions from Biswanath. Earlier leaders used to make decisions based on intuition, but it's now more data-driven decision-making. How much do you think technology, analytics, and hard skills are making more importance than just soft skills?
It's quite interesting. I would say today that, and there's no doubt, there is more access to data analytics, AI, and other forms of technology that allows information to be more present. However, there is also a very strong view that judgment remains critical, because any leader is under the pressure today, again, more so than probably ever, to be able to move in an agile form, but very quickly. And their ability to do all the analysis that's required is frankly such that they can't do it at that speed to be able to operate in an efficient way. So judgment, I would not underestimate, remains an important factor. I mean, it's interesting. Even last night, I was at an event with quite a remarkable lady, Indra Nooyi, who was the former PepsiCo CEO and chair. She was remarkable, and interesting, this point came up. And she has quite a remarkable background as a mathematician, physicist. And what was interesting in the way she answered a very similar question was, you will never move from the ability for a leader to have to judge. Often they have to be able to decipher good information and bad information, but relate it to the circumstances. And that will always, and certainly from what we're seeing and what we do, remain a priority in the selection of a leader.
Indeed, with the Global MBA, one of the programs, well, obviously the program that I'm responsible for as well, one of the key units there is called Generate Insights. And this taps into the whole notion of, we cannot keep pace of the data, the volume of data that is out there. In fact, we're often seduced by it, right? But it's our ability to harness that strategic importance of those nuggets that actually inform the decisions for the organisation that makes sense. Our ability to generate insights from that data is the judgment aspect that you're talking about.
It is, and just an interesting point on that. In terms of the amount of information that is received today, it is so important for a leader to be able to delve into the detail, but then pull themselves back. I think one of the risks that we run, and one of the things that we look at in leaders, is to ensure they have that ability to get into the detail. Because the risk that is run is that leaders stay at a very superficial, high level without truly understanding where the issues are and where they need to focus their time. So it does, as much as there's a great deal of data that's available today, the risk we run is that leaders start to think that takes away the obligation for themselves to be on top of the detail.
But to interrogate the data, I mean, a lot of the data can be good, and a lot of it can also be bad.
Questions.
And asking the right questions to be able to get the most out of it. Generate insights, I think, is it's going to be a topical thing that is going to be something that we predict is going to be a key skill. We know this, actually. We don't predict this. We know this by talking to our industry partners, that one of the key lacking skills of leaders is their ability to generate insights.
Yeah, and any engagement. I mean, I find it fascinating. One of the things that someone like I will do when I meet individuals and are assessing them for whatever role it might be, the CFO for an organisation or a CEO, the reality is what do they tell me when I assess them that I didn't already know? What are the things that they have unique knowledge and insight that others do not have? And so that continual necessity for continuous learning, again, is a critical factor. And it's the open-mindedness and the willingness for any leader to recognise it is continuous learning, because the information in the changing world that we're living in today is so rapid. It's been able to, in some way, keep yourself abreast of the changes personally.
That's right. That notion of lifelong learning kicks in definitely. Sophia, let's just turn to another question. Perhaps we might have time for one or two more questions. Can you read out the next question, please?
Yeah. So you've spoken about senior leadership roles, but are there any tools to identify and grow potential leaders of the future from the junior to middle levels of the organisation?
That's a great question. Who was that from, Sophia? Garal. Yeah, great question. So this is about succession planning, yeah?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is, one thing, it's tools. Yes, there are many tools that will be used to help assess the development needs and how you can have anyone coming into organisation from the outset and through their career. The most important thing that we are seeing is the recognition from the top of an organisation that succession should be right through the organisation, and giving people the opportunity to develop but get exposure to different parts. I mean, I think one of the most fascinating sectors at the moment that's being disrupted is retail. And one of the discussion points is around what Amazon is doing. And for anyone coming through a career at the early stages today, to have the opportunity to get exposure but development to help them progress through an organisation upwards but also across is really important. And I think that it's even got to the point where individuals are actually demanding that. And I find that young people, when they're going for interviews, and we can talk a lot about, they'll be very interested, what is the purpose of an organisation? What are the values? But actually, what is the opportunity from a career perspective for me to progress? What will I get exposed to? What sort of things can I expect over the next 2, 3, 5 so years? Again, remembering the world is changing so rapidly. So the predictability of what the world might look like, or that organisation for that matter, in 5 years may not be strong, but nonetheless, it is important, and there are tools, and it is important for any organisation today to be able to provide that to their staff, their people, as they come into a business.
Most definitely. One of the pain points, or I guess the priority areas that we come across when we're talking to industry partners, is how might they continuously provide opportunities for ongoing professional development throughout for that entire workforce. And so this is a key priority for most people and most organisations. And I think it's actually a reflection of where the leadership is, or the culture, the organisational culture on their lifelong learning.
It is, and you know, and today we're starting to see the more innovative organisations engage with, which is similar to what's happening here with Macquarie,
right,
engaging with universities to create much more relevant, practical, real-life experiences, but also engage with potentially industry players. So what I have seen being quite interesting is where employees will work with suppliers to that organisation, or with customers as a secondment, so that they start to get a full end-to-end understanding of the supply chain or the value chain. So that person develops in a value-added way, whereas only 5-10 years ago that wouldn't have been dreamt of, because it could be seen as a threat. So there are much more creative things that are developing today, which is critical, because again, it comes down to this agility. You need to create the agility amongst people as they develop through their careers.
And so some of the take-out messages from our conversation today that I keep on hearing is that the term agility, ambidexterous, being able to continually invest in your professional development, ongoing learning. And these are the things that we need to invest in ourselves if we want to actually progress our own careers as leaders, I'm hearing. I think we've got time for one more question, Sophia. What would that be?
From Orville.
Mm-hmm.
Is leadership today more focused on maintaining the status quo versus innovation and design thinking?
Kind of depends. What do you think, Peter?
I actually think it's not about remaining the status quo. It is so difficult for organised. They're under so much threat, whether it be disruption through technology, whether it be dealing with some of the economic issues that we're seeing, or political issues that we're seeing across the globe. There has never been a time that's more difficult to try and retain the status quo. Is effectively looking to, drive your business into a state of non-existence, would be the usual standard response. It is all around, how do you innovate? How do you create an ability to be relevant to the new world? Consumers today are so much more intelligent in terms of what they know if they're buying a product or a service. And if an organisation isn't able to deliver against that, they become obsolete very quickly. So there is no choice but to be innovative. There is no choice but to have a mindset of change, transformation. If there's one consistent theme we are seeing across the globe, regardless of whether it's a mature market or an immature market, if it's an Asian company or if it's an American company, the reality is all of them are subject to a drastic change, and what their organisation is going to look like in 5, and it applies to my own organisation, 5-10 years is likely to be very different to what it is today. So status quo, in my view, is not an option. Okay,
so it's changed, and then the question becomes, how do we actually implement that change? What does that change look like?
So the implementation of the change comes down to the mindset of the leadership. It really does. And this comes back to the initial question of, how do you ensure you've got the right leaders at the helm of an organisation to, 1, acknowledge change rather than deny it, but 2, to create the platform that can deliver, but also predict what the new world would look like. I mean, one of the intriguing things I find with a number of boards that I work with today, and this is only in the last 12-18 months, is today, this year, is recognition that around the boardroom table there is uncertainty, and that's the new norm. So they're working in this particular company that I was only with yesterday. They're in the energy industry, and the disruption around technology and energy and climate change on that sector is remarkable. But the reality is, everyone around the board is, rather than trying to think and plan what the next 3 to 5 years look like, it's understanding it's unpredictable. and therefore the uncertainty is a new world we live in.
I absolutely agree with you that I think that the only option is disrupting and finding new curves of actually how do we compete in this space. The hardest challenge is actually developing those organisational capabilities to make that happen. A leader can only do so much, and that is, a reflection of their ability to bring in the right set of talent to the table to actually pursue that vision. It's a hard thing to do, right?
It's a really hard thing to do, and you've got some counter issues here because you've got an environment where there's more regulatory and demands that are applying in markets where there have been behaviours that have developed, actions where governance is becoming more important, which in some ways puts rigour around and tightness around what an organisation can do. But at the same time, you're talking about ensuring leadership and organisations can be more agile. So there is a tension that is developing between the governance requirements that need to be put into place to protect the behaviours, ensure integrity, and the values and the culture of an organisation, but then allow the environment to be able to perform and evolve at the speed that's required.
Yeah, I really like that point that you just talked about there in terms of governance and compliance. I mean, one of the future webinars that we're going to be talking about is that whole very issue about compliance and governance. And Professor Elizabeth Sheedy, she actually develops and delivers a unit called Engage the Board as part of our global MBA. And she takes a very different lens on compliance. So she talks about compliance not from a risk mitigation perspective, but from an innovation-led perspective, but not being irresponsible about that. So I'd be looking forward to discussing that point with her, building upon that point that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that it'll be terrific to even put on the table with her.
Yeah.
Today we're finding one of the key roles of a board of directors is the culture of an organisation. Because we've seen behaviours across different sectors, whether it be financial services or others, where it's created so many issues that really the responsibility is being looked at by regulatory groups and government, that the board holds that responsibility. It's not solely held by the CEO or management going forward.
Indeed. Well, I think that we're just about on time now. I mean, there's no final questions or comments, so that I can see some other comments there that we'll take on as comments, as in thank you very much, Peter, that was great. A lot of those type of comments. Thank you very much for joining us, the people who dialed in. So, Peter, thank you very much for your time. It's been great chatting to you. Yep. So for our viewers, we'll have a copy of the white paper, Global and Regional Leadership, sent to you as part of the recording. Thank you very much for joining us on this sunny Sydney day. It has been miserable and wet throughout the week, but the sun's come out for you today, Peter. So thank you very much.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you very much.